When you think of Rwanda, maybe you picture the land of a thousand hills, right? It's this really stunning East African place known for its landscapes, the gorillas.
Absolutely beautiful.
But, that idyllic image, while it's definitely part of the story today, it also hides a very turbulent and often tragic past.
That's so true. And for this deep dive, we're going beyond just the surface, beyond the postcards.
Right.
We're really going to try and unpack the layers of Rwanda's history. It's complex. We'll look at its political institutions, the societal structures, and, importantly, the human experiences that have shaped it.
So what's our mission here exactly?
Well, our mission today is really to understand this cyclical nature you see, sometimes oppression, then resilience, and the deep, deep roots of the conflicts there, but also the incredible journey of the nation as it strives for reconciliation and, progress after just unimaginable trauma.
And we're basing this on some solid research, right?
Yeah, we're drawing mainly from a really comprehensive historical analysis, and we've supplemented that with various other scholarly works, too. We want to give you a well-rounded and hopefully insightful perspective.
Think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to understanding a country that honestly holds some critical lessons for the whole world.
Exactly. Because look, this isn't just a history lesson, is it? It's a story about how something like ethnicity can be manipulated.
Right.
How outside forces can completely reshape what's going on inside a country. And fundamentally, what it actually means for a society to rebuild, to try and forge a cohesive social fabric after these deep, deep wounds.
You're definitely going to gain some, I think, surprising insights into how these historical paths still influence things today, influence current regimes.
Absolutely.
So let's start right at the beginning, pre-colonial Rwanda. Because even back then, it wasn't simple, was it? What did it look like before Europeans got involved?
Well, initially, Rwanda was more like a patchwork, lots of smaller chiefdoms. The sort of economic and political heartland was down in the marshy valleys, the Nibargongo and Akajara rivers.
Okay.
And that area was mostly populated by Bantu farmer chiefdoms. It was diverse, but also kind of fragmented before a larger state formed.
Okay, and this is where it starts to get really interesting with the beginnings of stratification kind of taking root. We read that cattle-keeping Nilo-Hamitic populations settled later up on the plateaus.
That's right, the Bourbon and Kivu plateaus. And what's fascinating is how this changed the social structure. There was this group, the Njiga, who brought cattle in, and they didn't just set up camp. They actively intermarried with the Hutu families who were already ruling there. And gradually they introduced this chieftaincy system. And importantly, they reserved rights to land tenure for themselves.
So they consolidated power.
They did. And at the same time, other allied chiefs were building up this minority aristocracy, mostly pastoralists, people focused on cattle. So what this tells you is that stratification wasn't just imposed later, it actually grew sort of organically, though forcibly from within, long before the colonial powers even showed up.
But it wasn't all just immediate oppression, despite this forced stratification you mentioned. The source talks about the Bahutu peasantry not being completely pushed off their land initially.
That's a really important nuance, yeah. The sources talk about what they call the original Hutu egalitarianism. It suggests that even with these new hierarchies emerging, there was still some kind of economic balance.
Okay.
People weren't, completely dispossessed right at the start, which allowed for a certain level of stability to continue alongside the changes.
But then, if we jump forward a bit, say to the 16th, 17th century, the Rwandan Tutsi kingship developed something pretty remarkable. Our source calls it the most centralized system of rule that ever existed in sub-Saharan Africa. How did they manage that without huge armies and bureaucracies? That seems unusual.
It is quite striking, isn't it? The system was just so efficient, so deeply ingrained culturally and politically that it simply obviated the need for those massive armies or large bureaucracies. It really points to a very intricate network of local loyalties and administration. It's a testament to its sophistication, really.
And that sophistication extended to culture, too, right?
Yeah.
That period was incredibly rich. Things like Umuganura, the Harvest Festival, and Oburu, this complex system of royal rituals, they actually survived right through colonial times.
Yeah, and even music and dance, while they evolved more elaborate ceremonial dances, new dances just for women, unique pairing off traditions, many of the traditional instruments and the philosophies behind the rituals endured.
Yeah, cultural resilience is really key.
It is, and it brings us inevitably to a major turning point, colonial rule. The late 19th, early 20th century, that was a period of really heavy colonial domination for Rwanda. We're talking 1890 to 1916.
Right, the scramble for Africa era.
Exactly. And the infamous Conference of Berlin, June 27, 1890, basically just carved up the region. The western half, including Rwanda, went to German control.
And the Germans weren't exactly gentle about it. The sources call them ruthless strangers, imposing rule with iron determination. They faced resistance at first.
Oh yes, fierce resistance from the Rwandan kings initially. But what's really crucial here is that even using their strategy of indirect rule, the Germans started subtly shifting favoritism between the ethnic groups.
Ah, the beginnings of playing groups off each other.
Precisely. An early sign of a strategy that would have just devastating long-term consequences.
Then after World War I, Belgium takes over, around 1916. How did that transition go?
Well, surprisingly seamless on the surface, from German to Belgian control, but it introduced what the sources call a great inequality of information and bonding between Belgian administrators and the people.
Meaning they didn't really connect with or understand the locals.
Essentially, yes. And this lack of genuine connection, combined with the policies they did implement, really set the stage for future conflict.
And here's where it gets particularly, I think, chilling. How ethnicity was actively weaponized. In 1930, Belgium didn't just, happen to favor one group. They deliberately engineered ethnic antagonism.
Deliberately. Through a divide and rule policy. And why? The sources suggest it was partly to avoid the financial responsibilities of direct rule.
That's cynical.
It really is. Think about it. Colonial anthropologists were actively concocting this myth of Tutsi superiority, not because they believed it necessarily, but as a calculated tactic to solidify their own control.
The sources even call it made-in-England tribalism, which really highlights how these divisions could be imported or invented for a colonial convenience.
Absolutely. And this manipulation, it built on observations Europeans had already made, though those earlier observations didn't carry the same rigid political weight yet.
Right, they'd noted the three main groups, the Twa, maybe the original inhabitants, often potters, excluded from land.
The Hutu, Bantu origin, mainly farmers, politically tolerated but increasingly exploited economically by the Tutsi.
And the Tutsi themselves, often described physically tall, slender, and frequently the ruling elite.
But the key point the sources make is that this division became ethnological in description, social and political in explication.
Meaning it wasn't just about observing differences. It was about using those categories to create and deepen societal cracks, to set up a system for exploitation.
Exactly. And adding to this, the Christian church often colluded with the state, which further cemented this oppressive political system.
So this wasn't accidental. This engineering of division deliberately nurtured, as the source says, a deep-rooted feeling of antagonism against Tutsis.
Yes, and it led to actual policies like Bylaw 72 of 1958, which was applied so rigidly it fueled arguments for the, quote, legal extinction of the Tutsi dynasty.
Legal extinction, that's horrifying language. It shows how administrative tools can legitimize profound discrimination.
It really does.
So all this colonial engineering, it must have set the stage dramatically for what happened at independence in 1962. Because power shifted then, right? Big time.
Oh, absolutely. Power shifted decisively to the Hutu majority, and the immediate result was systematic discrimination against the Tutsi minority. Many Tutsis were forced to flee the country.
And the new Hutu political elites.
They adopted what the sources call exclusionary and repressive politics. They essentially modeled Hutu chauvinism, the cracks that colonialism had laid. Well, they were rapidly becoming chasms.
And those early attempts to actually build a unified republic after independence, they didn't go well.
No, by all accounts, they were poorly conceived and extremely ambitious, largely because there just wasn't the administrative or military capacity to pull it off. The country stayed divided provincially, and predictably, tribal politics reignited.
You see that fragmentation really clearly in the 1964 elections, Rwanda's first sort of liberal multi-party elections.
But instead of unity, they resulted in the few remaining Tutsi in government being ousted.
And that moment basically ushered in decades of dictatorship.
Pretty much. And that dictatorship was then cemented by the 1973 coup d'etat. That's when Colonel Juvenal Habyarimana came to power.
Running a military dictatorship, and interestingly, supported by a lot of foreign aid, extravagant foreign aid, the source says.
Yes. That support propped up the regime for years. But then, by 1990, a new force emerges, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF.
Formed by Tutsi exiles and refugees.
Exactly. They invaded from Uganda and started gaining territory quite rapidly. And here's another one of those really interesting complex moments involving international powers.
What happened?
Just as the RPF seemed to be having significant military success, Western powers intervened with something called Operation Turquoise.
Okay, Operation Turquoise. What was the goal there? It sounds like a peacekeeping mission, but was it?
Well, the sources suggest it was complicated. Partly, yes, perhaps framed as humanitarian, but also potentially aimed at preventing the total collapse of the Habyarimana Hutu regime, and crucially, maybe to block RPF investigations into foreign involvement in the crisis that was unfolding.
So external interests potentially trying to manage the outcome even then.
It paints a very complex picture, yes, of external actors playing roles amidst this escalating internal conflict.
And that conflict, it escalated into something just, well, unfathomable.
One of the most brutal wars in modern African history, as the analysis states, in just 100 days. Think about that, just 100 days between April and June 1994.
An estimated 800,000 people were killed.
Right.
Mostly Tutsi, but also moderate Hutu who opposed the killing.
The speed is just staggering. It makes it one of the fastest genocides in recorded history.
But the sources are really clear on this point. Despite the absolute horror, the roots were more complex than just ancient, deep ethnic hatred. That's too simplistic.
Exactly. While the hatred became the tool, the main causes were sociopolitical. They stemmed directly from the manipulation of the history of Rwanda by both colonial and post-colonial leaders.
So that deliberate division we talked about earlier.
Yes, alongside economic factors, that Belgian classification of the population into three distinct, rigid ethnic groups. It sowed its seeds of division, as the source puts it. It directly facilitated the mass killings later on. It created the categories that could be targeted.
And the spark? The immediate trigger was April 6, 1994. The plane carrying President Habyarimana was shot down by Hutu extremists, it's widely believed. What happened right after that?
It was terrifyingly fast. Within hours, literally hours, on April 7th, the systematic killing of Tutsis began in the capital, Kigali, and it spread like wildfire across the country.
How was it organized so quickly?
Hutu militias, especially the infamous Interahamwe, actively hunted Tutsis down. They often used lists that had been prepared beforehand.
Lists, my God.
Yeah. And places people thought would be safe. Hotels, schools, even churches, they became sites of massacres. The violence was utterly indiscriminate. Women, children, the elderly.
And the methods.
Horrific. Grenades, explosives, machetes, knives, burning people alive, mutilation, torture, systematic rape. And what's particularly chilling is that local authorities, mayors, officials were often spearheading these actions. Community leaders turned into organizers of murder.
It's almost impossible to comprehend. And during this, what was the world doing? The international response
is widely condemned in hindsight. That's putting it mildly.
Nations, organizations, they just did not respond adequately, quickly, or forcefully enough.
Peacekeeping troops already there were stalled, critically underfunded, and their rules of engagement were far too constrained to actually intervene effectively.
And the UN itself?
The UN and its agencies failed to properly identify or prioritize the killings for what they were. Genocide. They didn't call it genocide quickly enough.
And the U.S. specifically?
Termed passive bystanders in some analyses, even actively working to halt proposals for on-the-ground military intervention. It became a textbook case study in how not to react to a genocide.
A tragic failure that led to some policy shifts later, but the damage was done. Issues of accountability still linger.
Absolutely. A profound failure with devastating consequences.
So after the killing stopped, after the RPF gained control, what was left?
A nation in ruins, just utter devastation. Most infrastructure, roads, schools, hospitals destroyed. The economy was completely shattered. Shortages, massive inflation, production had plummeted.
And the human cost.
Hundreds of thousands killed, hundreds of thousands more in prison, accused of participation. Huge numbers homeless or displaced internally, or refugees in neighboring countries. The task of just starting over was monumental.
But by the end of 1994, the RPF, under Paul Kagame's leadership, they had established themselves. They formed a new government.
They did. They effectively, as the source puts it, exploited the leadership vacuum left by the genocide and the collapse of the previous regime. They saw an unprecedented political opportunity to build a completely new nation, hopefully free from the toxic constraints of the past.
An unprecedented opportunity, but also an unprecedented challenge. What do they need to do?
Everything, basically. Establish administrative systems, judicial systems from scratch, essentially, provide basic health and education services, rebuild the entire economy, and, crucially, enact laws aimed at national unity and reconciliation. It was a Herculean effort on every single front.
That justice and reconciliation piece, trying to heal those wounds, must have been incredibly difficult. Complex and multifaceted, the source says.
Immensely so. Think about it. You have to dismantle these deep-seated fears, these discriminatory ideologies that fueled the genocide. But you also face near insurmountable difficulties from things like genocide denial on one side.
And on the other side, a focus on victor's justice,
Right.
where the RPF, having won the war, controlled the narrative and the justice process.
Exactly. Which leads the sources to ask a really fundamental question. Is real justice and reconciliation even possible under those conditions? When the calls for justice from different sides are so fundamentally, perhaps irreconcilably different.
It highlights just how hard true societal healing is after that kind of trauma.
It really does.
So to try and create this cohesive society, the RPF government brought in policies promoting a one national identity and explicitly banned talking about ethnicity.
Yes, a very deliberate policy. The goal was unity, to prevent the divisions of the past from resurfacing.
A laudable goal on the surface.
Yeah.
But did it have any unintended consequences?
Well, the sources suggest it did. While aiming for unity, this policy, by essentially silencing discussion about ethnicity, inadvertently created political space for agency with potentially detrimental consequences.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning that by not allowing open discussion, underlying tensions or different perspectives might not be addressed, potentially festering beneath the surface. And the sources also note that dissenting views, or views that challenge the official narrative, are often met with a state monopoly of coercive practices.
So tight government control over the political discourse and any opposition.
Yes, it's a very managed approach to building national identity.
Which brings us to Rwanda today, in the 21st century. Because it is often held up as a success story, isn't it? A story of reconciliation and rebuilding.
Absolutely. You hear about it being a country on the move. It's had remarkable economic growth rates, sometimes 10, 11% GDP growth in recent years.
And improvements in social indicators?
Yeah, increased life expectancy, decreased mortality rates, higher incomes, better education levels. It's achieved what some call a stability decade.
It's even got nicknames like the Switzerland of Africa because of the hills. And Kigali is famous as the cleanest city in Africa.
That's right. Thanks to national programs, community work days, strict laws against littering, it presents a very organized, progressive image.
But, as always, it's complex. Despite this impressive progress and the focus on unity, are there still major challenges bubbling under the surface?
Oh, definitely. Yes. While it's officially a lower middle income country now, Rwanda still faces significant struggles. Poverty is still widespread, malnutrition is an issue. There are big economic disparities, especially between rural and urban areas.
And demographic pressures.
A high population growth rate, yeah. And high youth unemployment remains a challenge. And crucially, even though the Constitution bans ethnic divisions, geographical and socioeconomic disparities often still map onto those historical lines. So the progress is real, but it's definitely uneven.
And politically, what's the assessment there?
The sources consistently describe Rwanda as having a tightly controlled and hierarchical government. There's a long tradition of political centralization that continues.
So how does that square with the goals of unity and reconciliation?
Well, while unity and reconciliation remain the stated goals, the primary focus on unity has sometimes, according to the analysis, allowed for gaps in the understanding and management of conflict complexity. Meaning that in the drive for a single unified narrative, some of the deeper, more nuanced aspects of the conflict or ongoing societal tensions might get overlooked or suppressed rather than fully addressed. It's a potential blind spot in the pursuit of stability.
Economically, you mentioned the growth.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen this shift from just subsistence agriculture towards a more dynamic services sector.
Yes, and interestingly, despite not having vast mineral wealth like some neighbors, it often maintains a trade surplus. Exports have diversified beyond just coffee and tea.
And its resilience, how did it handle, say, the pandemic?
It actually rebounded quite strongly from the pandemic's economic shock, but it still faces risks, global conflicts affecting trade, potential slowdowns in the global economy, and climate change risks like drought. So progress, yes, but vulnerabilities definitely remain.
Now, another interesting aspect is how post-genocide Rwanda looked back into its own history for tools to rebuild.
That's right. They deliberately looked for lessons in its history, revalidating some pre-colonial institutions and practices.
Things like umudugudu, community cooperation at the local level.
Yes, and Gakaka, the community courts used for dealing with many genocide cases. And the concept of Imana, sometimes linked to peace and reconciliation. These traditional ideas and structures have been consciously integrated into the modern political system.
Why did they do that?
Well, the relatively swift period of peace and stability achieved after the genocide allowed the new government the space to promote development, and they saw value in drawing on these indigenous models. But
There's always a but.
there's always a but. This integration raises a really important question about the nature of this social progress. Is it genuinely leading to deep structural change? Or does it risk, perhaps unintentionally, justifying a continuity in oppressive rule by using traditional forms to legitimize a highly centralized state?
That's a critical question. The balance between stability using familiar structures and genuine democratic reform and openness.
Exactly. It's a central debate when looking at Rwanda today.
And Paul Kagame himself and the RPF regime internationally, they're often praised, right, for ending the genocide, for the economic growth.
Hailed, yes, for stopping the bloodbath and fostering that impressive development narrative. But that's not the whole story either, is it?
No, his international image, according to the sources, has deteriorated significantly more recently. Why is that?
Growing reports of opposition voices being silenced, increased repression, restrictions on freedom of expression within Rwanda, these concerns are mounting.
And the conflict didn't just stay within Rwanda's borders, did it?
Tragically, no. Rwanda's internal conflict transformed, as the source says, into regional war. Rwandan troops invaded neighboring Congo multiple times after the genocide.
Ostensibly to pursue those responsible for the genocide who had fled there.
That was the stated reason, yes, pursuing former regime leaders and militias. But many analysts argue it was also about asserting Rwandan influence and controlling resources in the eastern Congo. It shows how these conflicts can spill over and create new cycles of violence in the region. The past casts a very long shadow.
So bring this all together. What does this incredibly complex history mean for you, our listener?
Well, I think Rwanda's story is just a profound, if often painful, illustration of how societies grapple with these incredibly deep-seated divisions.
And the huge impact external forces can have, both negative and positive.
Absolutely. And the truly, truly Herculean task of trying to rebuild physically and socially after unimaginable trauma.
You've really seen this paradox, haven't you? A nation that historically had this highly stratified society, yet now is striving so hard for unity, for progress.
And the history of Rwanda, it reminds us that even though patterns of oppression can seem cyclical, they aren't necessarily inevitable. People keep striving. Human endeavors continue to aim for institutions based on better values, democracy, order, freedom, equality, even against immense historical headwinds.
The very fact that Rwanda's journey sparks such vigorous debate about that balance between unity and freedom, about how a society confronts its past, that itself offers a powerful lesson for all of us, I think.
It really does. And it leaves us with some lingering questions, doesn't it? Like, how much silence is actually required to maintain peace? And what might be the long-term costs of that silence? What stands out most to you as you've listened about Rwanda's ongoing journey to redefine itself and its future?